Yeah, so we're going to talk about decisions because decisions are really like important for life
Mm.
and critical and everything. But firstly, I was going to ask you about because thinking clearly is really important right now and it's kind of tricky. So, how are you thinking clearly at the moment with everything going on?
Good question. Well, there's plenty of time to be thinking clearly, that's for sure. No lack of time to sit down and think, which is actually one of the things that I guess I've literally been doing more so than in the past. In fact, I started to kind of think about mindfulness and meditation and those types of things probably over the last 6 to 12 months. But especially at the moment when there's plenty of time. So just actually taking that deliberate time out to sit down in the backyard or up in the bedroom with the door closed, use some of those apps that are available on the phone and sort of plug myself in with the earphones and just let my mind sort of clear, which is something I've never really done before. I was one of those people that kind of often thought that meditation was a bit of, witch doctoring. But I figure it can't hurt, that's for sure. So I've been doing a little bit of that and also actually getting into stoicism a little bit, getting into some of the readings of the Stoics, which is actually something that my old CEO got me onto, who was my boss for a long time. He used to sort of pull out these quotes all the time around Stoicism, and I always wondered what the heck he was talking about. So I started to pick up some books and read them. And the Stoics are all about controlling what you can control, and not spending too many brain cycles around the things that you can't control. Which I think, when it comes to thinking and decision making, are a pretty critical thing. So yeah, I've been doing a bit of reading around the topics of Stoicism and the likes of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and those sort of guys. So pretty interesting stuff.
It's amazing how many things around today, like I think that's what's amazing with philosophy is those ancient texts are like so relevant now and those ideas are so relevant and people, you know, repackage them and say them in different words, but it's essentially the same ideas that haven't changed for centuries. And they're just as important today as they were then. Like
Yeah,
humans
exactly.
haven't changed much. The world has changed, but
Exactly. I
as
mean,
what's the quote about running new software on old hardware and all that kind of thing? Like we're still like primitive animals at the end of the day, and that's why like all those things are still important, aren't they?
yeah, so much.
um
It's common sense, like you said. It's common sense stuff that you already know a lot of the time, but when you read it in a book or when somebody tells it to your face, you're like, oh yeah, I really should sort of take more notice of that. And that's often I just literally pick up the book. I've got I don't know, it's like a daily reading of Stoicism. So every day has a reading that you can read, and yeah, sometimes I just pick up and read that day's message, and it's just enough to remind you that, oh yeah, I should be thinking less about this and more about this. So yeah, always interesting stuff.
yeah, those little prompts to keep them in front of mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Good tips. So we're going to talk about big decisions,
Mm.
and I know something that how long have you been back in Perth now? Is it six
Just
months?
just over a year, actually. It's been a year. It's gone quick, but yeah, it's just gone a year.
So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about a big decision you made with your family and how you arrived at that. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the context?
Sure, yeah. Well, going back to what, 2015, I think it was, end of 2014, I had an opportunity to go and move over to the US for a job at a startup company. Nobody had ever heard of it. There was probably 10, 15 people at the time. And so we had to think about the decision to move over to the US as a family. Got two young kids that were, what were they, 4 and 7 back then.
Oh
And
wow.
so that was a decision that we had to make for sure. And then, of course, the other big decision was really the reverse of that, which was the more recent one, which was the having to come home again, which was just as big a decision as moving there in the first place, which, as you mentioned, happened about 12 months ago now. So, they're probably some of the biggest decisions. Obviously, affects so many different things, including not only my life, but it was also for the big thing for me, I guess, was how it affected the rest of the people's lives that I was influencing as well. So my wife and my kids especially, but also even grandparents who were taking the kids to another country and all those sorts of things. So they were the two biggest decisions that I've had to make for a while for sure.
Mm. What process did you go through on the initial one? Was there a process or was it just a right, we're off kind of a?
Yeah, I think there was a process. Not that we had a deliberate process to begin with necessarily, but it just turned into a process. As you can imagine, it wasn't a decision that was made overnight for sure. But I think in the beginning it was just basic things like we listed down pros and cons. I literally remember having a piece of paper. My wife and I sat there and we listed pros and cons. Now we didn't always agree on what the pros and cons were, but we had a list regardless. And that was a start. So it was those sort of process, that sort of basic process that kicked off some of the thought processes. Speaking to a lot of friends was another thing that we both did. Independently, I would go and confide or speak to people that I trusted and tell them about the things that I was worried about, and got some great common sense advice back. And my wife would go and do the same. We even sit down as couples, obviously, with some of our great friends over dinner and discuss it with them. So we got a lot of great context and feedback. Mixed feedback. Sometimes it was positive and you came away thinking we're going to do it. Other times not so much, and you'd come back thinking maybe it's the wrong thing to do. So there were a couple of great things that we did. I think the other thing that we did was we really got ourselves deeply immersed in kind of what it would be like to make the decision. So in this context, the decision being to move over to Seattle, which is where we were going. We lived in Melbourne at the time. And so by deeply immersed, I mean, we spent nights, every week, just hours on end at night, trawling the internet, going through, everything from Google Maps, putting the little man on the map and sort of seeing physically what things look like in the streets, to posting on messaging boards and really getting deeply immersed on, if we made the decision, what would life kind of be like for us? And I think, that really helped feel comfortable about what was going on, and how things might turn out if we ended up going over there.
It's funny, you just jogged a memory there. My husband Pete and I, before we moved from London to Perth, did very similar. I don't think you could Google Maps and look around at that point, but we would like look at the map of Perth and we'd be like, right, this Hay Street, this looks like it's an important road.
Right.
So the first thing we did when we arrived was walk the length of Hay Street to Subiaco, thinking that it was where everything must be centered. We just like, oh, it's so quiet and everything's shut. What have we done?
Yeah, well, it used to be the centre of everything, maybe about 15 years ago, but things change, of course. But that's right. I mean, with technology these days, there's kind of no excuse not to get deeply immersed. And I mean, we really found a lot of the, I can't think if they were Facebook groups or what they were back then, but certainly just a lot of the connection that we made with people before we even moved there, just to ask them questions, and where would our kids go to school, or even a lot of other Australians who happened to be over there already, we ended up connecting with and getting advice from them. So, that certainly helped. And I know you and I have talked before about something that I read about Jeff Bezos once, about his sort of interpretation of making decisions. In fact, he wrote this advice in, I think it was the very first shareholder letter that Amazon ever sent to their shareholders, sort of back 20 years ago or so. And he talked about making type 1 or type 2 decisions, and that's something that stuck with me for a while. When I read it, and so that sort of thinking came into play too. But a type 1 decision to Bezos was, decisions that we make mostly every day, the very common decisions that we can kind of walk through the door where we've made that decision, but it's not impossible just to walk back through the door again if you make a terrible decision and want to get out of it and want to reverse it. Whereas type 2 decisions to Bezos they are the life and death decisions. There's no turning back once you've made those decisions. But, the reality is that we very rarely have those type 2 decisions. And so, that was something else that my wife and I discussed too, is that at the end of the day, this is really one of those type 1 decisions where we could move our family over to Seattle, but worst case scenario, if things didn't work out within a month or two, we could get on a plane and move back home, and everything would be back to how it was. So, that's always a nice framework, I guess, to keep in mind.
Yeah, there's definitely the sunk cost bias, the cognitive bias that we all hold, that the more you put into it, the more you feel like you've got to stick with it. And so, yeah, I can imagine, you go, oh, well, the kids are in school here and we've got a house and we're pretty happy and we've got friendships. You go, well, am I willing to give up all of those things that I've already put effort and time and money into in order to go somewhere completely new, completely fresh, and start over? And it's funny you mentioned the Jeff Bezos thing. I was telling you earlier about Shane Parrish, who writes the Farnham Street blog, and so the matrix that he uses, which is kind of similar, is the how reversible and how consequential a decision is. And so exactly that, so many decisions we make, oh, well, what I have for breakfast, or do I go and meet this friend or that friend? The consequences aren't huge. And
Right.
even like buying a house, or getting married. They're actually reversible things, but we often forget that they are. I know I'm not saying you've got your phones in, you can't hear me. But you know, there's other life journeys that people can take. And so, you know, some people might have said, oh yeah, Clayton moved to America, but he moved back.
Right.
Maybe he made a mistake. And it's like, no, you learned a lot over there, I'm sure. And the same if I move back to the UK now, I would never say that it was a mistake to decide to move to Perth 10 years ago nearly. So,
Right, and I think
but
another one of those big biases comes into play that I see. You've spoken about quite a bit when I've been following some of your posts, and that's that kind of status quo bias. I mean, there was certainly that pull of, well, do we really need to change things? Everything's great here. Do we need to break our life essentially? So that pull, that status quo kind of bias is a very strong one to pull you back to, oh, maybe we don't really need to do that. And that's something I physically remember kind of having to overcome. And it was almost a feeling in your guts that you have. It's like we're breaking away from everything that we know, but once you've done it, you don't look back.
yeah, 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 definitely. And so coming back to Australia, what was the big driver for that decision? Because it was work that took you there, wasn't it?
Right, that's right. Yeah, and so we were there for nearly 4 years, and so it was never a forever thing. It was always something that we sort of had earmarked for, look, somewhere between 2 to 5 years, and we were kind of getting up to that 4 year mark. And there were sort of logistical things like visas that had to be renewed, but also our kids were growing up. Our eldest, our son, was kind of getting to high school age, and so there was that kind of decision-making process around, do we send him to US high schools? Do we start him in school in Australia? What effect is that going to have on him? And look, to be honest, I think this was 2018, so towards the middle of 2018, it was kind of inevitable that my wife and I knew we had to make this decision. But I think I can't speak for her, but for me, I was certainly just kind of ignoring it. To be honest, it was like, we'll make it next month and then the month after. But eventually,
Decision.
right. Well, it was a hard decision, and the thing is, we loved our life over there, and I loved the work we were doing. But it was sort of, it was these two colliding parts of your life. It's like that professional part of your life, and I guess my wife and I, as adults, enjoying making new friends and doing those things. But then there was also these two other human beings we were responsible for, and so it was like, well, what about the effect that it has on them? And so, look, essentially, that's what it came down to. It felt like the right thing to do from a family perspective, not only for our kids to start school and go through school as I did and my wife did as Australians, but also, we've both got parents who are getting older, and, we wanted to make sure our kids could spend time around our parents as well as, again, my wife and I had growing up. So I think that had a lot to do with it. It was kind of a lot of, we wanted our kids to have the sort of childhood that we remember having, which was going to an Aussie school, playing cricket on the oval, hanging out with your grandparents on the weekend, going for camping trips, the sort of stuff that we grew up with as well.
Mm. That's interesting, actually, because there's kind of this tension when it comes to coaching and stuff like that, where you go, all right, the individualist side of it is like, you do you make your choices, you live your life, don't care what anyone else thinks, it doesn't matter. And then the collectivist kind of side is like, oh, hang on a minute, there's other people to consider, and maybe you need to think about not just them, but their families, or how it will impact their partners, their spouses, their grandparents. Like, so we kind of get hung up on like how does it affect me? But yeah, it's also what's the impact on other people and how's it going to impact them too. That's really important.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah, cool. All right, thank you. And then so you've got your type 1 and type 2, or like I was saying, the reversible consequential idea of like basically a lot of decisions we make, they're just kind of experiments, right? They're just, you're trying something out, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, you learn,
Yep.
essentially. Take a lesson from that. And even, it's fine to make mistakes, but if you keep making that mistake, then you're daft, basically. We should try and learn from them and figure out, and how you frame a mistake is another point completely, I suppose.
Mhm.
But we talked previously as well about how you apply decision making like that in business, because you coach business startups specifically. So how do you apply that in a business context?
Yeah, well, in fact, you just made a very good comparison, in terms of how I would often explain it to people in business, and that's that, decisions really are parallel to experiments in business. And so I think what I often talk about with business leaders is that the first step before you can do any of that stuff is really to have a very transparent and trusting kind of culture, because I think that is behind a lot of reasons why people either make bad decisions or aren't wanting to make decisions that they think are perhaps the right decisions. They might make the decisions that they think everybody wants to make. And so I think having that culture of transparency and trust kind of gives you that safety of, knowing that if you do make an incorrect decision, that people are just going to say, well, no worries, it was an experiment. We'll learn from that and we'll move on. But you can only do that. You can only do that sort of experimental type framework in the situation where you do have that trust and openness in your culture as a company. So that's probably the first step, is to make sure that that's the culture that you're building as a leadership team. And then sort of moving on from that is a couple of steps that kind of, really get to the point of being able to have experiments. And that's also not being afraid of sort of saying, I don't know, as a leader. That's something that, again, that I learned a lot about because of the role models I had that were, leaders in the businesses that I've been in. But I think often when we're leaders, our job is obviously to make decisions. That's why we're in that position, and you do need to make decisions as a leader. I respect leaders who kind of make quick decisions, and in fact, I've been pretty impressed with a lot of the Australian politicians in the last 6 or 7 weeks, given the difficult decisions they've had to make. But I think, also as a leader, you need to be not be afraid just to sort of admit that you don't necessarily have the answer, and you need a lot of help from your team and from other leaders in the team to kind of give you some input. And so not being afraid to say no is important. And then to lead on from that, I think often leaders also fall into the trap of kind of looking for consensus when they're making a decision, which you don't necessarily have to have consensus as a leader. I think it's very important to get input, to make an informed decision from all the data that you have available to you with everybody in the room. But then this concept we used to talk about all the time in the startup that I was in, and I talk to people about now, is the concept of disagreeing but committing. So you may not agree with the decision that the leader makes, but you had your say, you've put your opinion across. If the leader decides that they're going in a different direction, then it's important that you're in a team where you disagree. Okay, that wasn't the choice I would have made, but then you commit and you get behind it as a team, and you do the best. Because again, there is a good possibility that it's one of those type 1 decisions, and the leader may end up coming back to you and sort of saying, hey, you know what, this didn't work out the way we thought it did. We're going to go with your idea. And so that's often what happens in a startup, particularly where it is a very experimental environment. So I think they're a couple of the lessons that you can apply that are kind of related to decision making, but specifically in that sort of business context. And it all starts for me around, as I said, the leadership team and the leadership of the company are very much responsible, I think, for building that sort of culture.
I think, like, when we first started working together, we talked about that thought diversity quite a bit, and the amount of needing to divorce emotion from your ideas, which takes a lot of guts and is quite difficult to do sometimes. I was just looking at a blog earlier that was talking about how much time is wasted on stuff which doesn't really matter because people are emotionally involved in it. Whereas the big decisions, people kind of, oh, I don't really want to deal with that. So they'll kind of not discuss those and spend much longer on the trivial things.
Yeah.
There's that office politics attached to it and things like that, in those kind of toxic environments.
Right.
Which leads us actually to my final question to you, was going to be about advice on tough choices. And I had a contact me today about some tough decisions that they've got. So the first one, you can give your view on this. I've already had a bit of back and forth with the particular person, but if you're in a toxic work environment and it is impacting on your health, like physical, mental health, feeling very anxious, what do? The way I saw it and framed it was kind of in terms of the effort and reward. So whether this person was willing to have the uncomfortable conversations that would be required to try and sort that environment out, or more worthwhile to go, this is obviously not for me, maybe I'll start looking elsewhere. Work situation notwithstanding, let's say, if this was
right.
not
yeah.
But yeah, sorry. So that was kind of where the conversation was going. But what would you say to a friend or a colleague? How would you approach the thinking? Not necessarily what would you do, but how would you approach the thinking for that?
Well, I think that framing it as reward versus effort is exactly the sort of approach that I would take as well. And I think I mean I've actually had these conversations with my friends in the past, so I can probably relate very well to those. And I think that is right. I think it's if this is something that's a massive challenge that the effort is not necessarily worth it, or is going to take more of a toll on you, and then there's the opportunity cost of all the other things that you could be doing, then go and do all the other things. Like don't necessarily fight a fight that isn't really going to have a massive reward in any case. But also, I think a lot of the time, I find at least in workplaces, sometimes people don't realize that they're being toxic. So I think another valid solution, I guess, is, but particularly in a workplace that has that trust and openness sort of environment, is to actually just confront the person who's kind of causing that toxic environment, and to let them know that they're being a jerk. Because again, in my experience, a lot of the time they just don't know. They're not aware of it. It's just how they operate, and it only takes one or two times to point it out, and they get very self-aware then that yes, this is who I am, and I need to change the way that I approach people. And if you're not willing to approach the person who's actually causing that sort of toxic environment, I think the other person to approach is often the leader of the business, or I don't know, your leader of the division that you're in, or the CEO, or whoever. I don't know a CEO who wouldn't like to know from an employee that there's somebody in the business causing that sort of toxic environment. Yet, this is something that I think CEOs get frustrated about often, is that, those subjects are very, very much tiptoed around when it comes to people telling the CEO. Nobody wants to tell the CEO that Bob or Jenny is causing problems, and they're often the last to know, which I think is very frustrating for them. So again, I think people just, don't be afraid of going and telling somebody who's a leader in the business that you do respect that there's just something going on that isn't right, that's causing issue, with other people in the company. Because leaders who respect the culture and people within the company, they'll do something about it, and they'll be very glad that somebody had the guts, if you like, to actually inform them and not just tiptoe around the issue. I think that's things that I would think about.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think you said about having the confrontation, like just calling the person out. I was talking to a friend recently about a younger female colleague of hers in a very male-dominated environment, which is pretty common in Perth in quite a few industries, and the need to either, like you say, go above or have the confrontation. But this person was in such a situation, they felt quite scared to have that confrontation, to call them out and call a spade a spade. But then I was saying, if you're the other person and you don't realize that you're doing that, that you're making that person feel uncomfortable, because, sometimes people don't, I would feel very kind of cheated if that person went immediately to my manager to complain rather than bringing it straight to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So trying to flip what's going on from the other person's point of view, like why might they be doing that, and what's a fair opportunity for them. And we might feel like, like when people miss cues and they say, oh, but I've told you about this, or I told you about that. You're like, well, you don't know if you've actually communicated that message clearly to them. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. No. That's right. And again, if you're in a work environment where it's so toxic that having that discussion with somebody directly is going to have repercussions, and there's no doubt about it, well then, it comes back to the first point we spoke about, which is, is this the right environment you even want to be in? Is it worth having this fight when nothing much is going to change, and you could probably go somewhere else where you're going to enjoy that workplace much better? So hopefully there's not too many workplaces that have such a terrible toxic environment. And I know certainly a lot of the leaders that I work with these days are much more people focused. They really understand that you just can't get away with having people in your organization anymore that cause those sort of problems. And also, they make available a lot more, I guess, resources and sort of counseling services and things like that just weren't available, a decade or so ago to their employees. So that if you are somebody who's either, causing that environment, it's not sort of, instant dismissal. It's not, a harsh word spoken to. It's actually, well, how can we help, you improve, essentially? How can we help you improve your behavior and the way that you display your emotions and become a person who can operate more effectively? And so I think that's something that a lot of workplaces do.
You want some critical thinking training from me, and the world is a better place.
Mate.
All right, another quick question was about someone who, I don't know if there's one child or two. I should have reviewed the message before coming online. But deciding what to do about work after children, whether to freelance at home or whether to go work part-time or full-time, which is, you know, a dilemma that many people with families face, like
Right.
what to do in terms of work.
Yeah.
Um, I guess for me, my immediate thought was the reversibility of the situation.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of mums get caught up on that notion of, well, if I go back 2 days a week to my old job, then I have to go 3 days a week, and then I have to go full time, and then that's just what happens because that's the pattern that most people seem to follow.
Yep.
Or I guess financial commitments might mean that they have to increase the hours. But just because everybody else seems to do it, or it feels like that's the popular kind of pattern, doesn't
Mm.
mean it's right for you, or doesn't mean it's not reversible, I suppose. But you know, you've gone through that. Your kids are a bit older now, but any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, I think we're lucky that we do live in an environment and an era with technology where it's actually really simple to kind of dip your toe into new things these days. It's not necessarily a massive commitment to at least try something out and see whether it's for you, you know, whether it's, like you said before, freelancing or trying a new business, or maybe you've got a new skill that you want to learn. Yeah, so much of that can be done fairly easily and sometimes even without any cost online, whether it's, you know, learning a course to become a designer, or whether it's, you know, opening up a small consulting business online that's you know, whatever, coaching or writing copy for people or whatever it might be. So much of that can be done on that kind of experimental basis that we spoke about before. You know, you can just try things out. If they don't work, usually you haven't lost a lot of time and effort, and you can try something else and see whether it works better. So, you know, I think yeah, my advice to my team in the startup was always to, you know, don't spend a lot of time planning, spend more time doing, because I always have been of the mindset that you're much better off executing a poor plan than having the most fantastic plan in the world, but never actually taking any action on that plan. So I think that's it. I think, you know, we can, as human beings, just sit there and stew on these things and, you know, I can't quite get ready to do that because I haven't thought of this part, or I haven't drawn up my plan yet, or, oh, I'm only thinking forward 3 weeks. I need to do my 3-year plan. I just throw all that in the rubbish and get out there and start doing stuff to try it out, because that's the best feedback you can get, really, is trying something out. If it works for you, then you'll know. If it doesn't, you can move on to the next thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think another thing that just came to mind as well is thinking about values as well, because there's so much comparison in, you know, how people decide to run their lives, and, you know, oh, she went back to work 5 days a week when the baby was 2 weeks old, and oh, she took 5 years off. Whoa. And like we were saying earlier about sort of that individualist kind of notion, you go, well, what suits you? What suits your values? Doesn't matter what everyone else is up to. If you can live the life that you want to lead, you have the income that you, and
Right.
you get to spend the time that you're happy with, like with your children or whatever it may be, then you do you, right? Thank you so much, Clayton. Thank you for your time. We did talk a bit longer than I said we would. You were right, about half an hour. But yeah, I really appreciate that. That was really fun, and I hope it was useful for those that joined us. Yeah.
Yeah, good
Thank you.
fun. My first Instagram live. So there you go. You've taught me a few things. So very good. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, we're learning. Cheers.